Well, High Commissioner, thanks very much for your time today. We appreciate you speaking to the ABC. Can we start, please, with an assessment of the numbers there on the ground? How many Australians currently in India are assessed by the department to be vulnerable, and how many have registered at this stage to come home?
So we've got around 10,000 who are registered with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and in the high 900s are classified as vulnerable. That number in part has been going up because, of course, over the past couple of weeks we've had a pause on flights. So this has never been a static number. Equally, the 10,000 registered with DFAT wouldn't reflect the entirety of the Australians in India, because there are many Australian citizens and permanent residents who throughout this crisis have happily been living with family and friends across India who haven't yet registered with DFAT.
How about families that have been separated? We heard some distressing evidence only a couple of weeks ago about families that have effectively been permanently or semi-permanently split by this pandemic. What's your assessment of the numbers there? And now that flights are starting to resume within the next few days, what's the government's plan to try and reunite some of those families, even accepting some of the enormous difficulties created by the limitations on unaccompanied minors flying back home?
Well, the difficulties in relation to the unaccompanied minors is that with the exception of Air India flights, which are currently in abeyance, no other airlines are willing to accept either over 5 or under 5 unaccompanied children. That's the first part of the problem. The second part of the problem, of course, is one of the reasons you would require them to be accompanied, particularly by a family member, is to go through the quarantine in Australia that every returning traveller from all over the world is required to go through. So it is a difficult issue. It's an issue that is being closely examined to see what can be done. But I say again that we've managed through some of the intermittent charters to get 20 unaccompanied children back to Australia since Christmas. We'll continue to try and do that when opportunities arise. But people in Australia should understand that these children are normally brought to India by their parents. They stay with their grandparents in a safe family environment, and they do that for a number of months, and then normally the parents would pick them up and return them to Australia. That's what's been disrupted, the fact that both India and Australia closed their borders. India introduced an international flight ban. There are very few flights in and out of Australia, and very few that enabled unaccompanied children, particularly young children, to return home with unaccompanied.
There have been some calls for the government to potentially do something like putting on a specific mercy flight, a flight specifically devoted to those unaccompanied minors to bring them back to Australia. Is that something that's being contemplated internally by the federal government?
Well, I understand that options are being looked at in Canberra, but understand that there's two parts to this issue. There is the travel back to Australia, and there is the requirement on unaccompanied children, as on everyone else, to go through quarantine when they get to Australia. And of course, you wouldn't expect young children to go through quarantine on their own.
All right, now the pause, of course, is about to come to an end. Repatriation flights are going to recommence. That's going to be welcomed by many people in both India and Australia. The government has laid out a rough timetable for the number of repatriation flights that it would like to see over the coming month or so. That will get a substantial number of people home, but it won't get everyone home. What sort of capacity is there over time to really ramp up that process of repatriation to try and get as many people home as quickly as possible?
Well, a good example, Stephen, is over the past 12 months, we've assisted over 20,000 Australians to return home. 38 flights were facilitated flights one way or another by the Australian government that returned over 6,500. The remaining flights, returned the rest of that, which is far more than are registered with DFAT to travel to Australia. So, the easiest way to solve this problem is when regular flights return. But even without the reintroduction of regular flights, we've seen over the past, it's not 12 months because flights have not been operating for the full 12-month period, a range of flight options available, commercial flight options available, that have seen around 13,000 Australians who have got home beyond the facilitated commercial flights organised by the Australian government.
All right, just finally, High Commissioner, the plane that brought in those medical supplies, the Prime Minister says it will carry out a number of vulnerable Australians to allow them to return home via quarantine. Now, can you confirm, will that plane be entirely full? Will every seat available, with social distance restrictions applying, will every seat available be taken up by a vulnerable Australian who wants to return home?
Well, tonight's plane, this Qantas government facilitated commercial flight has a capacity to take 150 Australians who are classified as vulnerable home. Regrettably, tonight's plane will not, because a number of those people who were booked on the plane have gone through the increased health checks being required of the Australian government and have tested positive to COVID. So Prime Minister announced 2 weeks ago that as part of future government facilitated flights for vulnerable Australians returning from India, that there would be additional health checks. Those checks are designed to, like the pause, reduce any additional strain or prevent any additional strain on Australia's quarantine system. Obviously, I'm disappointed, as are those Australians who will not be on today's flight. My team across India has worked hard to assist them to get bookings on this flight because they are vulnerable. But all passengers who were invited to book on today's flight were advised in advance of the new safety checks and all agreed to go through those checks.
So, High Commissioner, those people who have tested positive, who are unable to get on a plane because they've tested positive or because they're a close associate of someone who's tested positive, what happens to them? Are they prioritised for future flights home? What's next for them?
Well, regrettably, those people will have to return home, will have to deal with the COVID that they have or continue to isolate to prove that they don't have COVID. And until such time as they test negative, they will not be eligible to fly on one of these facilitated government flights. However, having been classified vulnerable in the first instance and having suffered this setback, that rating would not change.
All right. High Commissioner, I know you're very busy at the moment in India. We appreciate you taking the time to speak to the ABC. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.